Hello and welcome to today's Atlantic Circle InConversation event. My name is Magda Joshi. I'm the Events and Alumni Engagement Manager within the Philanthropy, Partnerships and Engagement team. I'm thrilled to see so many of you joining us today. We're very excited for this event, Human Rights in a Troubled World, featuring Baroness Helena Kennedy QC. Before we begin our event, I just want a few words of introduction and housekeeping. Today's session will last around 60 minutes, during which we'll hear a talk by Baroness Helena Kennedy QC, and then we'll have some time for questions and a discussion. During the talk, you are welcome to post your questions and comments in the chat on Zoom. We'll come back to them after the talk. Please keep yourselves on mute during the talk. I hope you don't mind, I might need to mute attendees as and when needed, so please excuse that. The session is being recorded and the recording will be posted on our UWC Atlantic YouTube channel as soon as possible. It is now with great pleasure that I would like to introduce our today's speaker. Baroness Helena Kennedy QC is one of Britain's most distinguished lawyers. She champions civil liberties and promotes human rights. She is the founding force behind the establishment of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at the University of Oxford. In 1997, she was elevated to the House of Lords, where she is a Labour peer. She currently serves as the director of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. Between 2004 and 2009, Baroness Kennedy served as the chair of the UWC Atlantic Board of Governors, and two of her children graduated from UWC's, one from UWC USA and one from UWC Atlantic. It is now with great pleasure that I hand over to our speaker, Baroness Kennedy. Thank you.
Magda, thank you so much. And it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. I feel that I too am one of the UWC community. And I wanted just to pay tribute to this great set of colleges around the world and the work that is done in giving opportunities to so many people who go on to do great things in our world. I just wanted to start by explaining what my own involvement. I was the chair of the British Council. I've always been a lawyer, human rights lawyer, and civil liberties and criminal defense lawyer all my life. But I've always done additional things in its public service of some form or another. And one of the things that I did in the late 90s through into from 1988 to 2004 was I was the chair of the British Council. The British Council, of course, is part of the arm of soft diplomacy that's done for Britain around the world. And a lot of it's through education, and a lot of it is through the arts and all the different ways in which we make connection with the peoples of countries rather than up there at the government level. And I had wonderful people worked inside the British Council, and a number of them, their children went to United World Colleges, in one place or another. And so I discovered a little bit about the United World Colleges that way. And then my daughter, who was, when she was in her adolescence, about 14, she found out about United World College Atlantic College down in Landwitt Major from a friend of one of her cousins. And she was a young Italian woman who had gone to Atlantic College and who spoke of it with such passion that Cleo got the bug and found out about it and said to me that she would really be interested in going to Atlantic College when she was 16. And indeed she did. And so in that way, as a parent, I became drawn into the whole ethos of Atlantic College and what it would mean in a period of transition in her life from being a child into an adult. And it was a most wonderful experience. And then her younger brother also got the bug and wanted to go to Atlantic College. And at the very last minute, his place, the head of the college phoned us and spoke to him, which I was very impressed with, and said one of the boys who was going to go to the college in the United States, his mother is very, very ill with cancer, and he'd like to stay closer to home. And we're trying to find somebody who might be prepared to swap places with him. And so Roland said he would do that. And he had the most magical time in the United States at the college there. So what are they doing now? Well, my oldest boy had already gone on to do other things, so he missed out on the United World College experience. But my daughter is now a doctor. She's actually at the front line working on COVID at University College Hospital, and it's pretty tough going, I have to say, but she's a wonderful, committed doctor. And my son is a film director. And so they speak with such love for their colleagues and the friends they made at the United World Colleges. And it was a great experience. And of course, what it does is it imbues something else. It's the ethos that comes with going to one of the colleges. And at a point, when I had finished being the chair of the British Council, I was asked if I would chair the governing body of Atlantic College, and I did that for a number of years. And again, it was a great pleasure to be involved in that way, and to try, as we did, to get scholarships for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. That's a great joy of the United World Colleges, is that it's the mix. It's not a venue for simply the children of the international class of diplomats or corporate families. It's actually bringing in people from very different backgrounds, and many of them from very disadvantaged backgrounds in parts of the world where the funding for this wouldn't be available. And it's made possible by the great kindness of former alumni and friends of the whole idea of the United World Colleges. And I want to go back to the creation of the United World Colleges because of what it was about, because the very name tells you everything. A united world. That was the idea that it should be about education for peace and justice in the world, a way of sort of bringing into education those values of mutual respect, of delighting in otherness rather than being fearful of it, and wanting to know about other cultures, other people, other ideas, to be challenged intellectually all the time. And I see amongst your number many of the people who I got to know when I was chairing the board. And also I see that Pelham is somewhere in the audience, and he was a great mentor to my daughter, and I want to pay tribute to him. But the idea behind the United World Colleges was an idea that, of course, has been close to my heart and has informed much of my life's work. And I now have the great good fortune of not just being a practicing lawyer, still doing cases, though less frequently than I once did, because I'm also in the House of Lords and involved in the legislature and the making of law. But I'm also the director of the Institute of Human Rights for the International Bar Association. And so really working on issues to do with human rights around the world. And when the schools were created and first became thought of as a concept for bringing together people in learning skills of leadership and learning about each other and about what would better the world, we were at a time in, I suppose, the evolution of this great world of ours, where the hopes for that were much greater. I suggested that I would speak about human rights in a divided world, or in a disrupted world, or I can't remember what it is. I always have to reach for at the last minute a sort of a generous title so that I can speak about what's happening now. And that's what I want to talk about today, is that our world is actually at the moment particularly divided. And we have to ask ourselves the questions as to why that is. And I do think that the hope that was created at the end of the Second World War, the feelings that we had to somehow take hold of this great world of ours and somehow move to a place where we worked together as nations, where we made for unification and peace, and that we created institutions that would make that more possible. And it wasn't that the world was not, was terrific immediately after the war. I mean, remember that, there were terrible things happening in the Soviet Union. There were camps there. China had still not, Mao had still not, his long march was not over, and China was not the China we know today. That didn't happen until the early 50s. So in that period after the Second World War, we also had Jim Crow law in the United States. We also had colonialism was ending. We had India becoming independent, and there was a lot of conflict in many different places still. But at the heart of it, though, of the great sort of dream at the end of the Second World War was the idea of creating a world in which there would be a sort of an order, that there would be a rules-based world in which people played by certain rules, and that it wouldn't be the case that judges would say, we just are passing law that has been passed by our parliament, but that there would be a sort of values introduced into all of our legal systems. And that was what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was about creating a template and saying, yeah, every nation may have a different system of law, but it has to conform to certain basic standards and values, so that we don't have the situation as we had. And judges were put on trial at Nuremberg too, because they had played their part in that whole horror of the Holocaust. So the world came together at that period in the late 40s, creating the United Nations, replacing the League of Nations, creating institutions that it was hoped would somehow weld us together and our common humanity. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention to protect refugees, the Convention against torture, the Convention to prevent genocide. All these things were being created in those years immediately after the Second World War. And there is no doubt that that it's a slow journey, and in the history of humanity, it's not surprising that these things take a long time. But there was a point, I have to say, when I felt very optimistic, and that my optimism was in the 90s. We saw the end of the Cold War. Human rights had somehow slowly but surely become much more embedded in the conversations of mankind. It was Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and those organizations which were about holding governments to account and saying, what about the promises you made? And we still had the memory much clearer in our historic consciousness of what was discovered at the end of the war. In fact, what people quietly and silently knew about, but the opening up of the camps of Auschwitz and Treblinka and the horrors that were on display, and to say never again. And so that was all still alive. When it got to the 90s, for me as a practitioner, by that time in 1991, I became a Queen's Counsel. I had had a very interesting and challenging legal practice. I did a lot of work around women's rights, but I also did a lot of work around issues like terrorism. Can you try people charged with heinous crimes? Can you keep the standards high when there's great public opprobrium for the things that have been done and for the issues at the heart of them? And I always find that much more an interesting challenge, believing as I do that law is very important and process can be very important in making sure that you don't lower standards because you don't like the cut of the jib of the people on trial. And so in the 90s, we saw the end of the Cold War. I mean, it was a great moment, that, and I'm sure that people like Magda are too young to know about it, but watching the wall come down in Berlin, watching at the tumbling of those autocratic communist nations behind the Iron Curtain, watching all of that change taking place and with such rapidity, seeing what happened at the end of apartheid in South Africa. That whole business of the 90s, where we suddenly saw the burgeoning of democracies. In Latin America, so many of those despots and those juntas and so on, they all began to crumble. And it was a moment of, for me as a lawyer, concerned with human rights, as a lawyer who was interested in the rule of law and how you embed that in places where it was not operating. It was an exciting time. And then I really did. I remember giving a lecture at the end of the 90s, and I was saying in that lecture that the 21st century was going to be the century of human rights, because I really did feel that there was a sense of or the language of it, for example, I mean, generals in armies would talk about the importance of protecting human rights. We were having discussions, of course, in the 90s about what happened in the former Yugoslavia and about bringing to trial those who had ethnically cleansed the Bosnian Muslims. And so there was a sense in which the legal way of trying to bring people to account and creating accountability and transparency and so on, it seemed to be coming to fruition. And while I didn't pretend and I didn't think that it was sort of going to happen overnight, I thought that we were on a trajectory. And sadly, the 21st century has not proved to be that place that I had been hoping for, because so soon into the 21st century, we had the experience of 9/11, the horror of that, but also the way in which nations responded to the rise of Islamic terrorism, the retreat from so many of the values. I mean, Guantanamo Bay with detention without trial, and it had to be lawyers going to the Supreme Court saying that people should be represented, that there had to be a process, it couldn't be indeterminate. And I regret to tell you that in the United Kingdom, we did the same thing. We introduced detention without trial for people that we suspected might be linked or be involved in supporting or being in terrorist organizations. And by doing that and detaining people without having a trial, because we were doing it on information rather than on evidence that people wanted to put into a court, we too were derogating from the standards of the rule of law that we have always been recognized for. And the cases, my chambers were involved. We did the cases that went all the way to the Supreme Court around the wrongfulness of detaining people without trial and for an unlimited time. And our Supreme Court, to its credit, it was then the appellate division of the House of Lords, upheld the right to due process and a fair trial rather than detention without trial, and saw it as a fundamental breach of human rights. And then there was a second case linked to that, which was about the use of torture, where not that we were torturing people ourselves to get them to confess to being Islamic terrorists. We did all that in the years of the Irish trials, unfortunately. But and we learned from that, we thought. But what was happening was that we were outsourcing it. There was rendition, and people were being taken to places where there was less concern about following the rules and abiding by the Torture Convention, which is an anti-torture convention. And so, but we were allowing ourselves to use the information derived from torture in our courts. So we suddenly saw this great drop away from human rights standards. And that was dispiriting. But one of the things that I think has been seriously dispiriting as the decades have rolled on has been the way in which, with this contagion of COVID, we've seen how governments, in fact, when your head is turned, act in particularly bad ways. And I see it now with the work that I'm doing for the International Bar Association, because we are constantly receiving evidence from places around the world where, unfortunately, the whole business of COVID has allowed for a retreat from the rule of law. And many of the things that are happening, I'm afraid, are happening without the response that you would expect from the international community that should be taking place. How do we get to a place where perhaps we are distracted? Well, obviously, we're all having to deal with the business of a pandemic, and our nations and our governments are having to really deal with challenges that they hadn't ever expected to have to deal with, or certainly perhaps should have, but had wishful thinking had taken over. But there's another thing that's been happening, which is the rise of populist governments, governments which fly under a flag of being democracies, but which are democracies in name only. What do I mean by that? I mean that that we're seeing increasingly elected governments, but where the elections take place on simplistic answers to very complex issues, where there is a corruption of the democratic process because of the arrival of social media, which allows for disinformation and distortion, where we have governments that often have little respect for the rule of law. Where you have populist governments, and they're very often led by, I'm not going to be sexist about this, but often by men who are very...
are you doing a bit later?
Are we having a phone call from somebody? Where I can hear somebody's phone. I just wanted to mention that. But if many of these populist leaders cannot take any criticism at all. They don't want there to be what is essential to good democracy, which is a real opposition, which challenges things that are seen to be wrong or right, but where you have in the course of that sort of debate and challenge, you get to better places. That's how democracy works. And but there are people whose personalities are such that they can't take criticism, and so they end up silencing those who are their opponents. They don't like the free press, and they don't like an independent media. So they either crush journalists and arrest journalists. And a lot of our work just now is around the business of attacks on journalism and journalists. The way in which then not only is it journalists are attacked, but the judiciary in these places is attacked if they make decisions that the government doesn't like, or usually the leader of the government doesn't like. And then there are ways in which there's capture of those things, those elements that are so vital to a democracy. Capture of the media. You get your friends to buy it up so that you don't have an independent media, where you get your judiciary, you say that you're going to reform it, and then you find that, in fact, anybody who's ever made a decision that the president didn't like gets booted out, and a whole cadre of new people are brought in who are going to be much more compliant with the wishes of government. And so the things that are the checks and balances that make for real and genuine democracy are no longer there. Now, I was going to talk to you a bit today about the things that are really on my desk at the moment. I mean, one of them is the business of China. China has always been problematic with regard to human rights and the rule of law, because the protections and values that inform the way in which we would consider that the rule of law should be administered just don't operate. The idea of knowing exactly what the evidence against you is, having the opportunity of challenging it, being properly represented, and all those different things just do not exist. In China, the understanding of the rule of law is we rule by law, and we decide what the law is, and you're supposed to comply with it. And folk often say to me, well, what does the rule of law mean? And the rule of law we've evolved the rule of law, first of all, to mean that nobody can be above the law. I mean, it had its start with Magna Carta, when the king thought he was above the law. But no engine of government or anybody, nobody should be above the law. And the law should be clearly stated, and people should know what the law is. It shouldn't be just invented after the event. And it shouldn't be retrospective, that you suddenly sort of, decide that you don't like something, and then you make a law, and then you arrest the people, behind the curve for doing it. And so there are particular rules around what the rule of law means. But at the heart of it, of course, is fairness, that you have processes that are fair, that people know what they're facing, and that the judiciary who administer the law have to be independent from government and have to be skilled in assessing evidence and really making decisions which are fair and proper and rely on evidence and proof. And I'm afraid that in too many places it's just not happening. so one of the great, I mean, I'm the International Bar Association, unlike other human rights organizations that specialize in a particular thing. Our thing is about protecting law, the rule of law, protecting judges around the world when they're under threat and at risk, protecting lawyers, independent lawyers around the world, or human rights lawyers around the world for doing what they do in protecting other people. And protecting an independent media, because you don't have any rights if you don't have a free press. I mean, that's the reality. Unless the people of a nation know what's going on, then you can never create the change or demand a different offering from government. You really need to know what's going on. And so it's essential to rights, and lawyers and judges who are independent are essential to rights, because otherwise you won't get them. And so those are the very heart of what we do, those protections. But we're also looking at the ways in which the systems of law can be hugely discriminatory and don't conform to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the values that should inform the rule of law and the way that law operates in any country. And, you know, in some of them, it's about women, the gendered nature of law, because women were not involved in the making of law. And until comparatively recently, even in Western developed nations, law was made from a perspective that didn't include the reality of women's lives. And I chair a thing now, which for the Helsinki Forum, which is for women parliamentarians in the MENA region, that's the Middle East and North Africa. Wonderful women politicians. There's no law to prohibit domestic violence. There's no proper law in relation to rape and sexual offences. And so, you know, the resolution of these things is to, you know, pay a compensation between families, or to get the guy who raped to marry somebody, as if that's going to cure the pain in a woman's heart and, you know, from what's happened to her. And there's all the business of shame and dishonor, and it's the woman who carries the can for it. So much of that stuff is just so absolutely a failure derived from law that was never made from the perspective of a woman's experience of life and what we mean by the protections that we think respect the humanity of somebody. And so you always get this business of it being thrown at you that, you know, it was Western generated, and it's just not true. You go to China, I mean, and people will talk about, you know, human rights, that they want their human rights. They know. And one of the things that has happened is that for all the downside of new technology, and let me assure you, there is a serious amount of downside, and the lack of regulation is a challenge to us as lawyers. But one of the upsides of new technology is the connectivity that it gives to peoples who are being crushed and who are often not able to know what goes on in other parts of the world. I do believe that one of the problems of our contemporary divisions, and the thing that has given rise to populist leaders, and our whole, I mean, we've just seen the end of Trump, and I'm not going to pretend to you that it hasn't been a source of celebration in our household. But I'm very happy to see someone who was a wrecker of the rule of law, a disrespecter of multilateralism, a disrespecter of the very things that are at the heart of a concept like United World Colleges, was in the White House, leading one of the great nations, you know, to which the world looked. And without its presence in multilateralism, it has allowed for, you know, an undermining of the United Nations. The United Nations is currently on the back foot. Now, to some extent, it deserves to be a bit on the back foot because it hasn't reformed and should have been much more prepared to reform before now. Having the 5 nations that were the big nations, as you know, influential nations after the Second World War, still as the only people on the Security Council. And that gives this inordinate power to China and Russia that they can veto. You know, just now, the United Nations wanted to make a statement on Myanmar and the coup by the military, and China vetoed a collective response to that to say that it was flying in the face of a democratic election. Because the veto is being used, basically, you know, holding the democratic world to ransom. And so it's a serious problem that the UN has not got to grips with the need for reform. But it's also on the back foot because the absence of the United States from multilateralism, the disrespect for the United Nations by Trump, fed into similar disrespect from other nations who then started pulling out of different conventions, and there was a sense that there was a sort of almost an erosion that if one wasn't careful that the UN would actually crumble. And so the Secretary General and the United Nations structures have been sort of holding back from issues where they perhaps should have been stepping forward. Well, I'm glad to see that Mr. Trump has now gone from the White House, and now there's a declaration that there will be a return to multilateralism, respecting that you need to have a World Health Organization if you're having pandemics, but you need to engage with other nations and to be supportive of NATO, albeit with everybody putting in maybe a proper share to the cost of it. But the other thing that has led to this has been the fact that with the end of the Cold War, not only came the burgeoning of democracies, but also an embrace of free markets. And it's been a particular form of free market. And it's been a form of free marketeering, which has, for my mind, has allowed markets to be to let rip in a way that has created much greater divisions between rich and poor in our world. And it's no wonder that there is so much disaffection in so many parts of the world because of the rise of that gap, which always sows the seeds of discontent. And we're seeing it at a level that we've never seen, certainly in recent times. It has grown out of all proportion. And so the creation of the just world that we all kind of hoped for hasn't been happening. Now, advances have been made, and many of the people who were poor in our world are not poor. I mean, they've got better conditions than perhaps the terrible horrors of the Dark Ages, but we're still, that people can see now. They can see how some people live. They can get on their mobile phones. Africa is, the penetration of mobile phones in Africa is the greatest in the world. People have more than one because they use one for selling their vegetables and some for doing other bits of business and so on. And so the penetration of the mobile phone has allowed people to see and that in turn allows people with political ambition and ambition for power to make easy promises to those who are angry and disadvantaged, and to come into power without the skills to govern well, and without the right kind of political purpose. I don't think that many of the autocrats in our current world, elected autocrats, have the concerns of their own people truly at their hearts. And so you have to look at what's happening in the Philippines with Duterte. I mean, and if we're talking about attacks on journalists, attacks on human rights activists and so on, absolutely horrifying. He wanted to do a war on drugs. It meant giving permission really to people to go out there and just murder those who were suspected of being in any way involved. No due process, let's not bother with that. Recently under COVID, I mean, he actually has said, put your head outside of the house and you'll be shot. And so the cover of COVID has allowed for an increase in the abuses of human rights. And we see in places close to home, like Hungary and Poland, parts of the wider Europe, where the attacks on the judiciary, the attacks on rights, for example, reproductive freedom for women, so many of those things that one saw as being part of the advances that were being made to make women more equal, to give women choices and for them to make the choices and not to be told by church or state. I mean, it's so important that we allow people to be making decisions over their own lives. And we're seeing steps backward. And so the challenges in our world just now are considerable. And I would say that the way that I give hope to everybody is that I do believe that the young want to make a different kind of world. And it was always the inspiration that I had when I came to United World College, either in the Atlantic College or my son was at the one in New Mexico in the United States. Being with young people, I for 6-7 years was the head of an Oxford college until I returned to the bar and to the work that I'm now doing on international human rights. And for 7 years, I was there, head of a college with wonderful young people. And my experience of my interaction with young people is that they do want a better world. They do understand that climate change is taking a terrible toll on the world. They are prepared to make real changes in the way that we organize our world in order to safeguard the planet, to look after our world for the future and for future generations. And they also do care about respect for difference, for people who are of a different race, who are of a different religion, whose sexuality is different. The tolerance and care and mutual respect for the dignity of the other is I think a growing thing amongst our young, and so that's what makes me hopeful. I don't want to be Pollyannish because I know that there are real problems at the moment with China. The work that I've been doing and we've been doing in Parliament here in the United Kingdom has been to look at whether at our trade relations with China. I mean, China has been criticized and there's no response. China's real fear and the way that it's ill treating Hong Kong just now, and I've been doing a lot of work around Hong Kong and the legislation that's been passed there and the erosion of the rule of law and the protections of rights there. Friends who are senior lawyers there are constantly in touch. And one of the things that China fears is that their young have now, many more have had the opportunities of education, many more. China is now a great consumer. It used to be the place because of cheap labor that produced stuff, but they're now also great consumers. And once people start becoming people who also themselves own things, have a sense of themselves as see themselves differently, they start wanting to have their rights. And so they fear that, and having Hong Kong next door and the young in Hong Kong demanding that freedom is part of the package and the deal. The more they have that on their doorstep, the more they fear that it will spread into China mainland. And so it's a very interesting thing, this repression that's happening just now, and particularly going after their supposed terrorists in the Uyghur, and so that every Uyghur is a terrorist and therefore they have to be dealt with. The persecution of the Uyghur there is really amounting to a genocide. And only last night, 2 nights ago in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, we voted that a British court should be able to make a determination as to whether a genocide is in process. And if it is proceeding, that the court should be able to make a determination. And then it will be for Parliament to decide how to make use of that determination, a preliminary determination, not a conviction of the Chinese nation, but make use of it in determining whether we should be having, what kind of trading relations, if any, we should be having with China. And why are we thinking of that innovative change in our law? Because we know that if you were to take China to any of the international courts, the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court for its genocide of the Uyghur, it would be vetoed by Russia. And so, we're being held hostage to these great authoritarian nations. And so we have to find other mechanisms and give other teeth to international law. And that's what the international legal community is now doing. One of the great rivals has been targeted sanctions. Instead of sanctioning a whole nation, which was what was always done, that you punish a whole nation for the wrongs that they do. And of course, it's the poor of the nation who suffer. It's the ordinary citizen of a nation that suffers. But now what has been invented is the Magnitsky Law, which is that you can target it against those who are powerful, who have great wealth, who salt it away in places like London or Manhattan, or in places where they can have property south of France and so on. And you can actually sanction their assets, freeze the assets, not allow visas to get them to come in, and so on. And you can really, make it pointed and go after the people who are the policy brokers, the power brokers, the people who are running these institutions of oppression. So, I mean, I think that probably that's as much as I should be saying just now, because I'm sure that there are lots of questions from you. But I think we have got a rather divided world. I think we do have to, now that Biden has gone into the White House and declares himself as a multilateralist, we do have to encourage him to really work with the United Nations and to, if you like, re-empower the United Nations. And it does, I'm afraid, take a place like America to do that, and to really let it start, using its heft in much better ways in the world, because it's been on the back foot now for a number of years. So I hope that this little ray of light will somehow start creating the kind of change that we need in our world. But we have to keep believing in it, and we have to keep believing in the goodness of people. And I know that there are very many of them, and a lot of them are produced by Atlantic College.
Thank you very much, Baroness Kennedy, for this inspiring talk. Lots of food for thought here, and things that I'm sure will stay with us beyond this hour. We'll now turn to your questions. I will invite you, if you'd like, to ask them yourselves, so it's more of a conversation. I will first turn to Ken Bluestone, who's posted a couple questions in the chat, but I also wanted to mention here that the next person was Elda, who also asked a question. Elda, your question, I believe, was answered as part of the presentation, but if there is anything you'd like to ask about further, please post and we'll come back to you. Ken, would you like to ask your question?
Thanks so much. I'm the father of two Atlantic College alums, and my wife indeed has been through the UWC system as well. So but I should also say that I'm a human rights activist and professional myself, specifically focusing on the rights of older people, and which is why my question is really about how the usefulness of international human rights standards beyond the strict legal framework, and their usefulness in terms of helping to reframe societal attitudes. We've seen this happening really powerfully with the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and how that's been this incredible pivot and leverage point for allowing society to perceive and to understand people with disabilities differently in society. And I'm just wondering whether you think that there is a possibility that the international community could be turning its attention now to tackle ageism that has really come to the fore so much in this COVID crisis that we've been living through, and whether or not you think that there's possibility for a specific human rights convention for older people.
Well, it has been so revealing, the way in which this recent period in which we have dealt with a pandemic in which the people who have suffered most have been those in that older age category. I'm fast becoming part of that older age community, but the ways in which there was such neglect at the beginning of what happened in care homes, and not just here in Britain, it was the same in the United States, it's been the same in lots of parts of the world. It really disclosed a sort of a lack of, if it wasn't about being cavalier, it was certainly a lack of consciousness of and not putting one's mind to the wider issues involved in human rights. You will know, as someone who's clearly very knowledgeable, especially around disability and around age, that the whole language and understanding of human rights isn't to be about law. It should feed into our daily lives for all of us, in the way that we treat each other, the way in which we treat each other inside families, think of the abuse that there is of children and so on, but also the way in which we treat our neighbors and the people close to us, the people in workforces who work with us and for us. And it is about a way of being. It always surprised me when we introduced the European Convention of Human Rights into the United Kingdom, and then we created a Human Rights Act. It was a great sort of moment of change, and yet so many of the tabloid newspapers presented it as being, you know, this terrible thing that was going to give rights to criminals and terrorists, you know, and bad folk, when not enough was being said about the way in which it could be a powerful instrument to assert values in a society. So should there be a convention on the rights of those who are aging? Absolutely. And should nations be signing up to it? Absolutely. Because we do know that it's very often the section of our community that's neglected, especially if you have the combination, the intersection of age and poverty. So I'm with you on it. The other area is about disability. We were slow in the human rights community, I have to say, has been slow in dealing adequately with the issue of disability. One of the issues that has been on my table recently has been the fact that domestic violence towards the disabled is one of the hidden horrors that people who can't defend themselves and who have to rely upon the care of others can often be subjected to terrible abuse, and work now on domestic abuse of women and sexual abuse of women. It has been seeing the hidden evidence, because it was not sufficiently investigated to know just how extensive it is, and it really is.
Thank you. I would now like to turn to Kaya Tetley. Kaya, I believe that Baroness Kennedy has addressed part of your question, but you're also making a comment here. So if you'd like to say a few words, please do.
Hello, I'm sorry for not having the video on, but hi, Helena and everyone. I'm an AC alumni and I live in Oslo, Norway. And I was also Cleo's roommate. My question is very simple, and I do think you have addressed it along the lines, but if you were to assess the situation of human rights and the world right now, are you more positive or negative or optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm not happy about the state of human rights in the world, Kaya. One of the joys of having children who've gone to UWCs is that their whole friendship circle and become friends of the family, and Kaya is one of those people for us, and she comes and has stayed with us and been with us. I am at times blue when I think of what's going on in the world, but as I say, I get sustenance from terrific people that I work with, wonderful human rights activists, wonderful people of good heart who contribute and make it financially possible to do lots of good work. You know, there are so many people who care about this stuff, and so I do keep thinking, you know, I don't lose hope. But I am only too aware of how serious the problem is, and it is grievous. You know, I went out. I was the UN rapporteur on extrajudicial killing. Put together a small team of us to go with her, who were experts for the purpose. I went to investigate the killing of Khashoggi. Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist who was assassinated in Turkey. And I went with the Agnes Kalama, the rapporteur, and a senior policing person and a pathologist. We heard the most terrible evidence of a man who, you know, who goes innocently into a consulate because he needs documents in order to marry. And you hear it. I heard his voice. I heard him being killed, and I heard his voice going in. A confident man of privilege who was a renowned commentator on the politics of the region, who wanted to see much more modernized Middle East, and his voice going from someone of confidence and pride to someone who knew that he was about to be killed, and you hear him being killed, and if anything brings home to you the horror of it, that those ruling a country decide that they don't like what you're saying, and so you're eliminated. And we've just had it in Russia with the going after Navalny. This business where you're so above the law that you can do what you like, and the silence that meets that. Where was the international community in response to the report that was produced about Khashoggi, or the evidence that Putin is going to stamp out Navalny and anyone who supports him? And so, there are reasons for pessimism. And so we have to cling to the things that are good, which are about the many voices of the young, particularly, who say, we don't want a world that's like this. We want something better. And just now I've been working with people in Belarus, a lot of people arrested there, and the lawyers there are seeking advice and support from us here at the IBA. And it's the bravery of people who go out day after day and demonstrate and get themselves arrested and get themselves bludgeoned, and in Hong Kong and in so many parts of the world, and met with the most horrible violence by the police and military, and yet they still believe that freedom is so important that they want it. It's one of those, it's a human yearning, and the human yearning to be free, to love and be loved. Those are fundamental things. To be able to exchange ideas, to know and understand. Those things are built into the human condition, and it's very difficult to thwart them. So I remain hopeful.
Thank you. We've received a number of questions from Matilda Legitimos Schleicher. Matilda, would you like to ask your questions?
Well, I can try. Hello, everybody. Hello, dear Baroness Kennedy. I am former pupil students from AC, 1977, 1979, and I'm living in Germany. I'm a French citizen. I've spent the last 42 years in Germany, where I'm married and I have my children, and I'm a civil rights activist and a social worker. My first question is, what can we do to force the Western country to take in refugees, especially minor children, and to force them to help people from drowning into the Mediterranean? The second question would be, well, I have to see my question. I think I had a couple of them. It's about the UN decade for people of African descent from 2015 to 2024, which is not really practiced and not really celebrated all over the world. I would like to know what can be done, because I think it's a duty. It's a kind of reparation also towards all the crimes done during the Atlantic slave trade. I myself, from the Caribbean originally, I mean, my great-grandparents were former slaves, and I think that it would be about time to do something against that. First of all, those two questions, please.
Well, you and I could spend an evening together trying to solve those
I would love to meet you and to talk to you. I've got a couple of issues.
Let me just tell you that there will come an end to this COVID, and at some point we will all meet and celebrate the end of all of this and come together again, I hope. But the business of migrants fleeing and fleeing so often conflict, or fleeing the impoverishment that's happening, for example, from climate change. Many of the people coming up through from Central Africa up to the traveling all the way those terrible routes, paying traffickers in order to get across, hoping to make a better life so that they can be the person who will send back money to their families and so on, and then drowning in the Mediterranean, or being picked up and then treated in the most appalling ways by the privileged nations around. And I feel sorry for Italy and Greece, because of course they've taken more than their fair share of the refugees have landed on their shores. I don't think that that we have shouldered this issue well enough together, the privileged nations of the world, and it's a source of great pain to me when I watch what happens, and the ways in which the language that's used to talk about those who are just seeking what any person seeks, which is a way of having a better life and a way of helping the people that you love and care about, so that you can send stuff back. I mean, it's heartbreaking to watch. Now, I have to tell you that there are lots of different things I might disagree with Angela Merkel about, but I did pay tribute to her for the way in which she very quickly took a significant share of the Syrian refugees who were fleeing from the appalling Assad regime, and then from the infliction of misery by militias and so on. So I thought that she did the right thing, although she's probably being faced the punishment of polling in her own country because people felt that she had been over generous. My experience is that countries are enriched by immigration, and that there's no doubt that those many people who came from Syria to Germany there will be huge benefits to Germany in the long run for having done that. But the problem about it is that in this moment, this period of time where the economics, neoliberal economics has not been successful. That whole business of driving down, taxation to the most minimal level, the way in which, corporates can move their tax, they choose where to pay tax, and they choose the cheapest place in the world. The ways in which evasion is made possible because governments can't keep up with the lawyering of the great corporates. So all I can tell you is that I do think that the economic system and I'm not anti-market. I believe that markets are important and one of the vital things that have existed forever and a day. But I do think that they have to be properly regulated, and you have to have proper welfare systems to help people in times of struggle, and you have to have proper working conditions for employees and not short-term contracts and gig economies and all of that, because uncertainty creates high levels of anxiety and mental unwellness and so forth. So you really have to revisit. The people of this world have to revisit what became the sort of default position, which was neoliberal economics. The World Bank bought into it. Every bank, the European Bank, every bank bought into it. The IMF, they all bought into it. And the idea was that you cut to a minimum the size of the state. And if anything's taught us that you need a significant state, it's the COVID crisis. Because nothing works in trying to deal with a pandemic if you have no state worth talking about, or a dysfunctional state. And so I feel very strongly, Matilda, that we have to revisit the financial structures, helping the poor of our world more, helping the development of Africa. It has not been the decade of Africa. And we weren't helped by the fact that Trump used the most derogatory of terms about the African nations, really, really appalling way of describing Africa. So what is the answer? The story of the exploitation of Africa, the servitude and the slave trade, the story of colonization and the European nations enriching themselves at the expense of Africa. that story has to be part of all of our histories and understood by everybody if we're going to make a more just world. And so I agree with you in the sentiments you're expressing, which is that, you know, why has so little been made of this? And we know that there's a justice in the rage of so many African Americans, for example, about their treatment, because as slavery ended, they then became the victims of incarceration. They were criminalized. They were given the sort of, they were not given proper employment. There was actually a policy which was to use them in a different form of servitude, which was to incarcerate and then use the labor inside prisons to deliver many of the things that America needed. So I'm afraid that I am in sympathy with what you're suggesting. Do I have solutions to all these problems? I wish that I did.
But the decade, it's still going on and nothing is done about this special period that should be really honored and celebrated, and to put just the spot on a Black citizen, on racism, to maybe teach really critical whiteness in all schools where Caucasian people are not aware of the past, and to correct the history books all over the world with the participation of the former colonized countries.
Absolutely. And I do think that the Black Lives Matter movement was hugely informative to people and meant that people started looking at those histories in other parts of the world, because the death of George Floyd, it hit a nerve, and of all the stories of the people who had been treated in similar ways by a horrible form of policing, and then of course the same kind of reflection has happened in other countries too, and certainly it's happened here in the United Kingdom, of looking at the disproportionate number of our young Black people who end up in prison, the disproportionate number of people of color who are stopped by the police on a regular basis and harassed and so forth, the ways in which the Black community still is disadvantaged in the job market, in the education world, across the board. And so there has suddenly been an examination of some of this, and a demand that this history is revisited.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious that we are past the hour, and I am also aware that our speaker has another engagement later this evening. So I am aware that we have a number of unanswered questions in the chat. I will have to find the best way to get some answers to those of you who've asked the questions. I'm also, I think it also shows how this discussion, you know, provoked us to raise a lot of human rights related questions and comments. So we will, as an institution, will definitely have to continue this theme into the future. In the meantime, I would like to thank Baroness Helena Kennedy very much for her time and for this thought-provoking talk and for all her comments. We hope that you enjoyed being with us and sharing your thoughts, and we would like to, yes, thank you very much.
It was very nice being with you all, and I wish you well. Thank you.